Hello there. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth, and this is the Right to Read Initiative, a place where we spread information about teaching best practices when it comes to reading and information about the Ontario Human Rights Commission Right to Read inquiry, a report and its recommendations. Today, I have the pleasure of having Alicia Smith from IDA Ontario join me, and we're going to be speaking about how the report is making changes and the changes that we're seeing within schools, districts, and classrooms, aligning practices with those recommendations from the report. Thank you for joining me today, Alicia. Can you just give people a little bit of background about yourself if they haven't heard you speak before?
Sure. Thanks so much for inviting me back to join you again. I'm always happy to join you and have these discussions. So for anybody who doesn't know me, I'm the president of the International Dyslexia Association Ontario branch. IDA is a charity. It's run by volunteers like myself, and we work to make the world a better place for individuals with dyslexia. And our main focus is trying to do that by ensuring that teachers are empowered with the knowledge, tools, and resources necessary to teach every child to read.
And really, the research shows that with the proper systematic explicit instruction, we can have 95% of our students reading by the end of first grade, so that they are decoding words. And that's not just looking at the dyslexic students. It's looking at all students within the classroom, regardless of first language, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status and family background. So I think that's a goal that we should be reaching for. And these recommendations in the report really help us get there.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the real power of the Right to Read report is that they're looking at it through that broad lens of equity, recognizing that, every student is entering kindergarten, entering the school system with a different background, and that we need to meet children where they are, identify what their needs are, and ensure that we're providing them with the support and the instruction that they need to move forward. And of course, monitoring that, their progress, so that we can identify when challenges are happening, so that we can get in there and keep every child on track instead of waiting and letting some kids fall behind and then trying to catch them up later. That's very inefficient and it's not fair to the child. So yes, that's one of the big drivers and the things that I find so motivational about working in the dyslexia advocacy sphere is that it really extends so far beyond dyslexia.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's where, unfortunately, some people have a lens of seeing that this report is only discussing individuals who have dyslexia. And when really we know that these best practices that are discussed in the report and the recommendations for teacher training and changes to education program, professional development, are best practices for all students, regardless of background. There have been research into looking at English as additional language learners. These practices are the same, and students that have different cognitive deficits as well. So you know what, this is going to help a student with autism learn how to read, or some of the other exceptionalities. And that's really important, that we're trying to shift our instruction from only targeting a certain percentage of the population in the classroom to that broader 95%. And that's how we create equality. And that's why we have public education, right? It's supposed to level the playing field, but it's not doing that in a lot of places currently, because we're not using instructional strategies that are going to reach all of our students.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's the instructional strategies, but it's also the systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So really, I see the Right to Read report as creating a framework for equitable education that can extend even beyond literacy. It's about doing that assessment right up front in kindergarten and having that done in a systematic and consistent way, so that every child, regardless of which teacher they have, which school they're in, all across the province, that we're in a systematic and evidence-based way evaluating them when they come in to see what it is that this child needs. And then we have a system in place for ensuring that that child gets what they need. So that's one of the criticisms that people keep saying about what's in the right to read is, people who don't really understand structured literacy will say, oh, it's a one size fits all approach. And I feel like that's the exact opposite of what this report is all about. It's actually about making an individualized, tailored approach for meeting the needs of every child. So to do that, you need to really understand the needs of every child. And that's why that early screening piece is so important. And that's one of the things that we really are not doing at all in Ontario in any sort of systematic way. There are certainly piecemeal efforts in different places, but there's no consistent approach. I know my own kids were not screened for any of the developmental language pieces in kindergarten, except for oral language. That was it. And it was, because my kids had strong oral language skills, it was assumed that they wouldn't have any problems. So they weren't, and when I say oral language, not like phonemic awareness, they were not screened for that. It was just, can this child follow instructions? Do they have a good vocabulary? Yes, they can. It'll be fine, right? So nobody looked at phonemic awareness. Nobody looked at rapid automized naming for my children. And those are things that would have really, had we known that in kindergarten, helped to save a lot of heartache and headaches and frustration and agony, frankly, on the part of my kids, right? So that's what I see that it is about. It's definitely not a one size fits all approach. It's about meeting every child and creating a systematic way to respond to their needs so that we can have equitable education.
Well, and the important thing to note about that universal screening, as it's not just filling in a spreadsheet with results, it's actually taking those results and using them to inform the instruction and making sure that classroom teachers have the knowledge and understanding of how to give those assessments. They're not very time consuming. It's about 5 minutes per student. And you get to have that detailed understanding of your student quickly, efficiently, and it's not the same as just gathering it throughout the weeks that you're first working with them. You spend 2.5 hours screening your class at the beginning, and you have a great place as a jumping point from the start in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, pre-kindergarten, if that's happening where you live. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that even though this was done by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, these recommendations are not locally just applicable to Ontario. They are applicable across Canada. I've been speaking to people on this podcast from the United States, Australia, New Zealand, England, Scotland, Ireland, and they're all saying, yeah, this is great. And there have been reports similar to this. It's looking at the research and best practices, and it gives an outline. But I think this is the first one that I've seen that really goes into the detail of saying, this is what we need to take out. This is what we need to put in. These are the goals that we need to have for the students. But look, we also need to do this for in-service training. We need to do this for pre-service training. This is what we need to do for the resources in the classroom. And it really lays everything out sequentially. I believe there are 157 recommendations. And, it takes a long time to go through the whole report. But even just going through the recommendations themselves, you can get a lot of information, especially if you're knowledgeable about structured literacy and this area. So it's not like you have to go read the 400-page report to get a good idea of what it's saying. If you're questioning about one of the recommendations, you can reference the report and see where they're getting that information from.
Yeah, the report itself is incredibly detailed, and I think they have really, really laid out an excellent plan. I love that there were 157 recommendations. There needed to be that many, and it covers everything, as you say, from in-service teacher training to pre-service teacher training to the screening and assessment, curriculum, intervention, all sorts of pieces of other sorts of policy pieces that all really need to be addressed. And it is a big report to go through for sure. One thing we did was we spent the entire month of March. I had 4 practicum students from the Faculty of Education at Queen's who did an alternative practicum with us for the month of March. And The 4 of them spent the entire month with me going through the report and reorganizing those recommendations into who the recommendations are for. So we have a list now of like, here's all the ones that the ministry needs to take action on. Here are all the ones that school boards need to take action on. Here are the ones that are for faculties of education, and here are ones that are directed right at teachers or principals. And then also within that, sort of organizing them to be like, here are some things you can do right now. Because it's, I think for a lot of people, it's really understanding where to start. Like that is when you've got such a big report and 157 recommendations, trying to understand what you can actually do right now to get started is really a bit overwhelming and a bit daunting. So we're trying to break that down and make that a little bit easier to see, sort of a path forward. And then looping in as well the school boards in Ontario that have been very proactive. There are a number that had started getting ready in anticipation of this report coming out. So based on the experience of those boards as well, looking at what seems to be working for getting moving with this sort of system change, because it is a really, it's a system change. So it's not something that's going to be achieved overnight, but we need to get started or we're never going to get there, right? So it's like giving people those first steps is our kind of our next step.
Well, and it's not like these recommendations are meant to start at number 1 and sequentially go through them. Because they're directed at so many different levels, we can see change in those levels. And I think that's what we want to focus on our conversation today, is how those changes are actually occurring. And, you know, there's great educators and people in these different areas across the country, across the nation, across the globe, that we can take leads from and examples from. And so let's talk about the teachers that are making those changes. I've spoken to several teachers where it's just one of them within a school or a couple of them. They're like, hey, have you heard about this? And they make those changes. And, you know, the first year, everybody in the school is like, yeah, whatever, they're kind of doing their own thing. But then when kids from that classroom go into the next year, they're like, whoa, these students are at a very different place than the other students. What's making this happen? And, you know, I think that's, you know, it's a beautiful thing to see, and then have that natural inquiry based approach into learning about the science of reading or structured literacy, research-based practices, whatever you want to call it. But we don't have time for that, in my opinion. We need to have made these changes 20 years ago, because really that's where the research is dating back to. And there have been advocates since then trying to advocate for this change. So we need to do everything in our power to get that change and make it explicit, right? And that's one of the things that we're talking about in the report, is the difference between explicit and implicit instruction, and the need for that explicit instruction. And we need to have that going forward for our educators so it can happen on the school level. So what are you seeing in, you know, the teacher-led change within the schools?
So I'm seeing a lot of that. Like, so right off the hop, teachers are enthusiastic about this. There are a lot of teachers that are really stepping up and leading. I see a lot of book clubs are happening, a lot of I think you're talking with Kim Lockhart tonight. She's got a journal group that's happening. So there's a lot of individual efforts that are happening across the province. Those have been going on now for quite a while, and they've really picked up steam since the inquiry came out in February. And so those are great in terms of getting people interested and excited, for sure. I agree with you that like that on its own is not going to be enough, but I think that on its own, that is really necessary, is what I'd say. So one of the things that I think has been a downfall of change in the past was that there wasn't enough nurturing of that grassroots teacher-led, teacher-directed learning. And I'm afraid that if we make it entirely top-down, that we're going to not have the buy-in from the teachers. So I feel like there is that enthusiasm, there's that spark of interest there. So what we need to do is to really feed that, to give teachers the time to host those groups, to give them the space and the permission to, you know, in school boards, use board infrastructure to host those groups themselves. In some school boards, I'm seeing things like boards offering small grants for these book clubs so they can purchase the books for the book clubs. Like these sorts of efforts from the top can really support those. And as much as I will say we need good leadership from the top, it can't be all top down. We need to really build up the enthusiasm from teachers and allow them to learn and be curious. And I'm afraid that if we just throw a new curriculum at them, it's going to backfire, and we're not going to end up moving forward. So it's going to take time for that to happen. But in the time that that's happening, I think there's a lot of things that we can do as an organization. IDA or is trying to support those efforts. Other groups that are interested can also support those efforts. And at the school board level, that's one of the things that I really think school boards need to be doing right now, is really encouraging and in supporting those efforts that are teacher-led and teacher-driven.
Definitely. And, there is a huge knowledge jump that needs to happen for teachers. And I think it's important to highlight that it's not their fault that they don't necessarily have the background in this information and best practices. It was not included in their pre-service training. And it's not something that you can just read a book and completely understand. It takes time. Research is showing that it takes between 3 and 5 years to get from a balanced literacy curriculum, which is what typically schools have been using for several decades now, balanced literacy or whole language, to a structured literacy, science of reading practice. And it's not something that's going to happen just from book knowledge. You need to have that community of teachers and that support where you can, get mentorship and ideas of how to do this. Now, on Facebook and social media, you see all these great groups, the science of reading, what I should have learned in college. Those, there's a big one that has, I can't remember how many 100,000 members at the moment, but it's amazing. I talked to Donna Heidemek, the creator of it, in one of the earlier episodes. And it's really, really fantastic to see this movement happening and teachers recognizing that they do need to have that solid professional development. So the next level is when you have that literacy coach or literacy consultant that works with one school or within a couple schools within a district. And I think they play a really instrumental role in helping support the teachers because they can kind of parachute in and help them in those areas. Now, what are you seeing on that level of the literacy expert within the schools?
So that is, I totally agree with you. Having those coaches that can actually go into the schools and co-teach with teachers, help them sit down with their data as they're starting to gather data and understand what to do with it. Like we really need to have that coaching model happening. Unfortunately, I don't see it happening in a lot of places very effectively, is what I'd say. So there are some boards that are doing that. And I know that their coaches are in the schools and they're absolutely doing that. Algonquin and Lakeshore Catholic, Sarah Cassidy and Lori McCaw are out there. They're doing that. They're in the classrooms and they're helping the teachers look through the data and figure out what the next lesson sort of things that they need to be doing. So that's fantastic. But what I see more often than not in school boards is that they do have this big layer of literacy consultants that work for the school board, or this is the literacy team, and they seem to be duplicating a lot of effort across the province. So they're all, in 72 different school boards, we have these groups of people that are working through the report, trying to figure out what they're supposed to do. They're all designing resources to be used in their board, and making very large like literacy websites and things like this. So there's so much duplication of that. I would really love to see more from the province of the province doing that piece, because the teachers need those resources. Like the boards are right in doing this because there's no other place for the teachers to get those resources. But I've seen a huge variety in the quality of those resources that are being created. So some boards have gone as far as to create their own scope and sequence, which is great. Other boards, it's so very airy-fairy. So it really just depends on the school board, right? So there's a huge quality difference. But in the boards that are doing a good job of that, it really does take a lot of time to pull together those resources, put them all in a central place so that teachers can have access to them. And that's something that teachers absolutely need. But because they're spending their time doing that, they don't have enough time to get into the classroom and do that co-teaching. So I would love to see the Ministry of Education put more resources into, or put, a team together centrally, provincially, to create a provincial repository of resources for teachers. So there's like one scope and sequence that we're using right across the province. And here's the lesson plan templates that you can use. And here are word lists and all of the different things that teachers need, suggested readings and all the stuff. Like there's a lot of time and effort that some of these boards have put into creating really fantastic resources that they're sharing. But it's just seeing that duplicated in 72 different school boards across Ontario. It's just, the effort of those people could be so much better, so much more effectively spent in the classroom, right?
Yeah. And I know when the report was first released, IDA Ontario hosted a symposium with some experts, various experts that gave great conversations. And one that's really standing out to me is Dr. Nadine Gabb from Harvard. And she's saying, don't waste your time creating all this stuff, right? Because it's expensive and it takes a lot of thought and effort. And, it's better for the board to look at what's existing and available to then use that and go from there. So if they come up with a few options, or sorry, the ministry comes up with, these are the options. And I think one thing, I think having a specific scope and sequence is incredibly important. But I think there can be a little bit of flexibility as long as you say, okay, we want these grapheme phoneme correspondences covered in kindergarten, these ones in grade 1, these ones in grade 2. The specific scope, very often it's SATPIN, right? Which is SATPIN are the first letters that are taught for the grapheme phoneme correspondences. But I've seen other programs that have, I don't know them off by heart, but they start with like M and N and other ones. And I think having a couple scope and sequences, as long as at the end of the year, it's consistent with the correspondences that are taught, it's okay, because we have to also consider the resources that are available as far as decodable books. And if a school or a district has invested a lot of money into decodable books that follow a different scope and sequence, I think it's important, as long as there is a quality scope and sequence, and getting the students at the same place at the end of the year, whether they start with, A and I or O and E, does it really matter in the end if they're going to have all the vowels at the end of the year? In my opinion, it doesn't, as long as it's well thought out and it covers, the digraphs that they need to know early on for something like QU. I really think the TH digraph is the one that needs to be in there early on, because the word "the" is going to be in pretty much all of those decodable books, the first levels, right? So it's important to teach them. And the TH or "th" comes up in a lot of those words. So having that knowledge is really important for the students. So we're not saying, oh yeah, you just have to memorize it, because they don't have to memorize it. They have to add it to their phonics knowledge so they can use it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And for sure, there needs to be flexibility. And I think people can argue about exactly which scope and sequence to use until
cows come
there
home.
is no one scope and sequence by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that what I'm seeing right now is that there's a lot of duplication of effort, and it's because there is a lack of resources that have been provided by the Ministry of Education. So really, the Ministry of Education, I hope, will be providing more guidance, but more specific tools and resources. Like we should have a provincial repository, essentially, that every teacher could access, that would have decodable sentences and lots of things that they could, and it's already all been developed with public dollars by the different school boards, right? There are some school boards that have really beautiful repositories that they've already put together, which took tons and tons of time and effort of staff to vet different resources and pull them together from different places and put it up there, but it's only available to their staff, right? So the board right next door has got to go out and reproduce that. And, and as I said, some of them are really fantastic, and others, things that I've seen have been quite questionable, I'd say. So there's a big quality issue too, right? So if we could have that done provincially, I think that would be great, because teachers need those resources. It's not reasonable to expect teachers to pull all of those resources together individually. Like, that is not at all a reasonable expectation for teachers.
And we don't want them to resort to going to teachers or, Pinterest to be grabbing these resources that aren't necessarily really what they're advertised to be. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Unless the school boards want to start giving every teacher like 2 hours of prep time a day, like that, you can't expect them to be preparing their own resources. You need to give them the resources. Yeah. So
now there are a couple other people within the districts that I think are really important to mention that can play a key role in helping us make this change. And those are the speech and language pathologists, the school psychologists, and the occupational therapists, because they all have a role that they can play in this. And one thing that, yes, the report is called The Right to Read, but reading and writing go hand in hand. And, many people have the analogy that reading is breathing in and writing is breathing out. So we need to have that aligned while we're teaching this. So while we're using these best practices for teaching reading, we need to pair it with the best practices in teaching writing. And so the speech and language pathologist can come in and help teachers learn about phonological awareness and phonemic awareness and how to do it. Most teachers off the top of their head can't tell you that there's 20 consonant phonemes and 24 vowel phonemes in the English language. And they'd probably have to sit and think about them, right? And then even thinking about the position that your mouth is in when they're making those sounds. Now, there are going to be some students that need that explicit support and understanding. The vast majority of students won't in the classroom. So I don't think it's mandatory that every single classroom teacher learns all of their articulatory gestures, but that they can realize, okay, I know that this student needs support in this, so I need to get support from my SLP within the school. Or, I've done this screening. I'm not too sure about it. So I'm going to talk to the school psychologist who knows about this, has been trained in this, and they can help me interpret the results and guide best practices for these small group instruction. The occupational therapist, while it may not be specifically for reading, that writing side of the equation, we see their research is showing that it's important to have that connection between the actual penmanship and writing when they're learning the letter formation. And I know there's arguments about technology, but I think at least for the next 50 years, being able to print and handwrite is going to be still an essential life skill.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you're right about like the role of all of those other pieces within a school board. Like I've seen some really amazing work, especially by a speech and language pathologist, that's happening. Mm-hmm. Actually, the set of resources, one of them that I had in mind when I was talking about the really good ones that school boards have developed, is from Eastern Catholic in Ontario, and that was developed by their SLP team. So they've put together an entire, I think it's a Teams or Teams site, I guess, for all the teachers in the board to be able to access this really rich set of resources. Because in addition to understanding about phonemic awareness and things like that, SLPs have had a lot of training. Some of them have had a lot of training in other aspects of literacy, and some of them are just really, really interested in teaching and the science of reading as well. And so if you can tap into that knowledge within the school board, there's a lot of boards as well where the SLP teams are leading professional development around the science of reading. So that's handy too. We did a survey last fall that was really interesting. We had 900 people fill out the survey, and we asked them if and it was all educators, but different types, or people working within school boards, but different roles, right? So we asked them if they learned about the science of reading in university, or what you learned about it in university. And when we sort of looked at the data that came back, it was like about 15% of people said that they had learned something about the science of reading in university, which 15% seems low, but it also seems high, if that makes sense. It's kind of in between. And so we went and we looked a little bit more closely, and the 15% were almost all speech and language pathologists. There was only 6 teachers that had said, yes, I learned about these concepts in university. So the SLPs have a lot of knowledge to share, as do the psychologists and the OTs for sure. But
And
I also see, unfortunately, a conflict between those teams in school boards instead of cohesion and really like teamwork and everybody working together. So many times I've spoken with SLPs that really don't feel encouraged to share their knowledge. They've been overtly told to stay in their own lane. You shouldn't be telling us anything about teaching. And typically not from classroom teachers. I shouldn't say that either, but there is definitely a power struggle that's going on there. And that's really unfortunate because it's really not putting the needs of the students first. Like that's what we should be doing at every turn. And if you've got people within your school board that have knowledge to share, we should be empowering them to share it, not letting, egos and, this is my little sphere of influence over here, you stay over there. Like that shouldn't be getting in the way. But unfortunately, in a lot of school boards, it really is.
yeah, well, and the speech and language pathologist has so much knowledge, and it's not just about articulation. They can definitely help when you have students that have English as an additional language. They have a better knowledge base about the phonological structure of other languages and helping the student hear the phonemes that are different in English to their first language or their home languages. They also have strategies for developing vocabulary and comprehension. And yes, that's oral language. But when we look at one of the major theories behind the science of reading or structured literacy, it's the simple view of reading. And that boils down reading comprehension into word recognition. So the ability to look at a printed word and decide what it stands for. So if you see the word, the letters PIN, that says the word pin, and you can recognize it and have it in your vocabulary. But you also need that language comprehension piece. And you need to be able to understand spoken language in order to understand the words that you are reading and make meaning from them. That's what our goal for reading instruction is. Our goal is not to have word callers that can read the words but not understand them. It's not to have people that can understand the language but not read the words. We need them to be strong at reading the words and understanding the spoken language. So putting those two together with strong skills is what's going to make a strong reader who can comprehend what they're reading. And doing anything that we can to support that and not worry about titles or roles, I think is really important. And also, I really like that, in the past few decades, that team teaching mentality has really come into play, where you see classroom teachers working together. And I think that's really important, especially when we're having groups of students that are struggling in the area or weak in an area. And if one classroom teacher has a strength in supporting that area and another has a strength in another, there's no reason, in my opinion, that we shouldn't play to those strengths and have students working together, even though they may not be in the same classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm seeing that, I will say, in a lot of the schools, especially that were early adopters of structured literacy, they really do take a collaborative team approach. So one of the most interesting things, and this was like long before the inquiry came out, but right at the beginning of COVID. So there's one school in Kingston, Ontario that has a number of teachers. It's where Emily Moorhead teaches. And so they've been interested in structured literacy and moving forward with it for quite a few years now. And at the beginning of COVID, so that initial school shutdown that happened in March, that was the only school that I know of. I'm sure there are maybe some others where, all of the primary teachers sort of got together and worked on creating little like video lessons essentially, but they were sharing them amongst, kindergarten, grade 1 and grade 2. So they were doing assessments. So they'd say, well, this child is struggling with this skill. So this teacher is going to make that lesson and we're going to share it with all the kids that have that skill, regardless of what class or what grade they're in, right? And they did that really collaboratively. And I thought that was so amazing to see that was happening. and they still managed to move their kids forward, even with that disruption of school and with the kids being, over Zoom and all of those things. They were still managing to move their kids forward, which was just amazing to see. So yeah, that collaborative piece. So I've really not seen too many problems with teachers doing that collaborative piece. It's really more at the leadership level where sometimes I see that is struggling. But there's some really good examples of fantastic leadership going on in Ontario as well. There's a number of school boards that have really made a concerted effort to bring the teams together to create a plan for the right to read. So that's, I think, the first thing that we're asking school boards right now to do. Is to recognize that you can't do all 157 all at once. It's going to take time. It's going to take concerted effort. But the first piece really is leadership and communication. So you need to, first of all, communicate with the teachers, the parents, the principals, with the entire board community that, this report is it is about equity, and equity is one of our core values. Pretty much every school board has equity as a pillar in their values, and as we will be doing this because this is an important equity piece. So making it very clear that this is not something that you're going to dodge or just try to cover, bury in a shelf somewhere. This is something that we're going to do. Just make that commitment and make that communication clear. But then recognize that getting there is going to be a challenge because, there are all of these different people with different ideas of what should happen. And there's a lot of systems that are well established, and it's difficult to sort of change the way things are done. But the only way that is going to happen is if you really get a diverse group of people together from all the different departments within a school board. So curriculum and special education and the SLPs, the OTs, the psychologists, but also bringing in actual frontline teachers, not just ones that, taught in a classroom 15 years ago and have been in a school board role ever since. You need to have kindergarten teachers there. You need to have ECEs there. In Ontario, we have ECEs in the kindergarten classroom with the teacher co-teaching. They should be represented too, as well as school-based special education teachers and principals, vice principals. Like, you need to get all these people together to, first of all, really spend some time reading the report together as a group so that you can understand it and understand what's in there, and do some professional learning together so that you can, create a common vocabulary around the science of reading and structured literacy, and a common understanding of why it is that we need to do these things and what the things are that need to be done. Then once you've done that, that's what we're really hoping. And some boards are doing this. I will say there are a number of boards that are absolutely doing this right now. You need to do that for a little bit of time. And then that group will be in a place where they can sit down and really collaboratively construct a plan for the school board going forward, because every board is really in a different position in terms of what the needs of their population are and what it looks like to have coaches. Some school boards are huge in terms of geographic area. How are you going to do that in Northern Ontario? So that's why each board really needs to come up with a plan that works for their board. But in the absence of that plan, nothing is going to happen. And if that plan is just created by one group of those people that I mentioned, it's not going to really reflect what's needed for everybody. So that's what I'm really hoping school boards are working on right now. And I'm happy to say that there are a number of boards that are absolutely doing that. So hats off to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so the next level, I guess, is that administrator level within the school. So the principals and vice principals. And, when I've talked to various people, they're saying that that's that crucial role of having that united front with the principal, and if your school has a vice principal, that they have that understanding and the importance of keeping this information connected to the student throughout their education, because we don't want to be starting at square one in grade 2 or grade 1. Once they've been at the school for a year, all of that information should move forward about intervention and progress monitoring and everything, so that we're not starting at square one every year. And having the principal and the vice principal take that leadership role and helping the continuity of the information across, and also in the professional development with the school, and you're taking that role and saying, what, let's do a book club or a journal club. And I think it's great when a teacher does it, but I also think it's amazing when the principal takes the lead in that role, saying, as a school, this is going to be one of our focus, because there are, oftentimes that they say, okay, this is going to be our focus for the upcoming year. Right. And, whether it's social, emotional, or bullying, like anti-bullying, racism, like those sort of things. Well, I think literacy should definitely literacy and numeracy need to be at the forefront. Right. And you have to have the understanding that you can't fix everything at once. But one of the things that I think a lot of people overlook is the importance of that success in learning to read the first time you were taught. And if we are able to get it so that 95% of the students are there by the end of grade 1 and still there by the end of grade 3, a lot of those other issues aren't going to be as big.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that principal level is so important, right? Because they are the leader for the school, for the building. And I think it really needs to start with training and learning for principals with other principals. Like before you can lead, you really need to understand the content yourself, right? So we have had a number of principals that have that I know of that have taken, a course like Big Dippers or something like that. And I would love to see school boards, putting together training for the principals soon, like over the summer. I mean, it'd be great if it started already so that they can be in there leading those book clubs with enough knowledge to really lead those discussions, because it's really difficult to expect a principal to lead and oversee an implementation of structured literacy if they've never taught it themselves and they don't understand really what it should look like. One of the school boards, Algonquin and Lakeshore, again, I keep talking about them because they do so many amazing things, has taken that document from the Reading League, which is the red light, green light document. It's sort of a set of look fors, and they've customized it for their principals, in the context of like, here are the things that we've been doing in our school board and the things that we know are happening that we would like to change. And they've taken that document so that principals can use it when they go and they're having discussions with teachers if they're going into classrooms. But the thing that they did that I think is really nice is that they also added discussion points. Like, how do you approach this discussion with the teacher? Because that can be a really difficult thing as well. There are conversations that need to happen, but they need to happen gently, and they need to be well thought out is what I'd say, to make sure that we can keep everybody moving forward and not call anybody out. It's really more about just bringing people along, right?
And realizing that everybody's at a different step in their learning. I know I'm really excited because next week I am speaking with Dr. Matthew Kierstead, who is one of the principals that worked with Dr. Giorgio in Alberta and saw these amazing results with their readers even during COVID. So next Tuesday, I'm going to be speaking him about his journey. And then we're going to be talking about how he's made the changes within his school next Wednesday. So I think that's going to be an important conversation. And from other conversations that I've had, another thing that, if you're in that administrator role, realize that it's not something that you necessarily start first in the kindergarten classroom and do it, incrementally a year. You need to really take stock of your school and have an understanding of where the teachers are currently at, because it may be that some of your intermediate teachers are already there and ready to take that next step. So having that support and not saying, okay, well, this year we're focusing on, the K1 or the pre-K1 years. You need to realize that, as the leader, you actually have like this huge weight on your shoulders, which I think everybody knows and understands, but doesn't necessarily appreciate the amount of time that, a principal or a vice principal puts into this. But being able to jump in and support those, 5, 6, 7 teachers, right? Or, whatever grades are within your school, and not just expect it to happen sequentially.
Yeah, I would completely agree, because structured literacy is not something that is just a kindergarten thing, right? Like it, all the way through, there's lots of different things teachers can do. And I think it's also really within a school, recognizing that there's a lot of information out there right now. There are a lot of teachers who are really, really interested in this stuff and have already gone out and done their own training, and are keen and just waiting for permission, essentially, to start talking about it and to share it. So for a principal, like, start by looking at your staff and figuring out, like, who are those teacher leaders that you have in your school that you can tap into? Like, who is your Madame Lockhart? Who is your Emily Moorhead? Because I think there are those teachers in every school. You just need to find them and support them and make them feel empowered to share what they've learned with the rest of the school community. Because even now, even after the right to read, I'm still talking to teachers all over the place who have principals that they're afraid to share their knowledge of what they're doing because they don't think that their principal approves, right? And so they're still closing their door and doing it, behind closed doors. And that's it's such a waste, because that teacher, if you gave that person permission, if you made them feel really good about what they're doing, they would lead that. They would create this excitement amongst their colleagues, and it would just make the job of implementing the right to read so much easier. So that's really unfortunate. And in those cases, like, I honestly don't know if that is the reality, that the principal really doesn't support it, but because there hasn't been explicit instruction at this point from a lot of school boards, have really not said a lot to their staff about the right to read. Teachers are still not confident and comfortable, sharing what they've learned and leading those groups within their schools. So I feel that's a huge missed opportunity. Those teachers are ready to go, and tapping into those and figuring out who they are if you're a principal has got to be the thing that you need to do.
For sure. Now, we need to go further. It can't just be all done within the school, right? We need to look at district and how the district can support. You've mentioned some really great districts in Ontario that are really embracing this. Can you see or talk about what you've seen across this whole inquiry and what they've been doing to really get the ball rolling on this change?
Sure. So different districts, different things, of course. So there were 8 school boards that were audited, we'll say, as a part of the inquiry. There were the sample group. And so those boards have been meeting with the Human Rights Commission over the last 2 years. So they've had a far more advanced notice, I'd say, than the other boards, in terms of really understanding what was coming down the pipe and what the OHRC was looking for. So some of them have started to do some great things, like Ottawa Carleton was one of the boards, and they've really invested heavily in teacher training over the last 2 years, which is amazing to see. That's kind of where they're starting in their board. But also boards that were not part of the inquiry have been moving forward. Again, back to Algonquin and Lakeshore Catholic. So they actually put training all of the teachers in the science of reading in their multi-year strategic plan, I think back in 2019. So they're just a standout district in terms of that foresight. But because it's in the multi-year strategic plan, it's coming from the top. Everybody in that board understands that this is what we're doing in this board. So they've had really fantastic leadership, right from the director and their superintendents and their literacy consultants. They're all on the same page. So they've had consistency of messaging, which has been, I think that is so important, to have that consistent messaging happening. So that's really good to see. And then there's lots of other boards I can point to. I know Waterloo is doing this. I think Niagara Catholic is doing it as well, where they've put together those teams of people, like multi-stakeholder teams that I was talking about, to really learn about this together and make a plan. So that's great to see in those boards as well. But I think it's that consistency of messaging coming from the school board level that is missing in a lot of boards. There's a lot of mixed messaging that's going on, or there's some boards that are even openly saying that they're simply not going to do it. And that's because there really hasn't been enough direct messaging coming from the Ministry of Education. So the Ministry of Education did put out a new guide to instruction in, I don't know, it was about 2 months ago it came out. But it's pretty short. It's only 10 pages, right? And it does come out, and it has a lot of good terminology in there, and it clears out some things. It's got some good science of reading terms. But the thing it didn't do is it didn't come out and explicitly say, we're not doing these things anymore, right? So some people are interpreting it to mean, well, we can do this and we can do that. We can do both 3Qing and we can do explicit systematic instruction and decoding skills. Why not? It doesn't say we can't. So that's really a problem, because there are some boards that's really the messaging they're sending to teachers. Oh, structured literacy is an optional intervention that you can use in your classroom if you so choose. So that's not helpful. And that's, the boards that are making the best progress are the ones where they have taken the time that's necessary to get everybody at the top on the same page, and they are committed to it, and they're making that clear to the principals, to the teachers, to the parents, to everybody, that this is the direction we're moving in. It's going to take us a while to get there, but we are committed to eventually getting to that destination. So it's really that leadership piece that we need to, I think if we had a little bit more explicit direction from the Ministry of Education, that would be helpful.
Definitely. And, we need to make it so it's not up to a lottery as to whether a child's going to get what's best for them academically. And it shouldn't be based on, what classroom they're put in. Any classroom within the country should have the same access to learning how to read.
Absolutely. And so much of it right now is absolutely left up to a lottery within the public education system. Like, are you in a school that has a teacher that's interested in this, in a school where there's support for it, but within a school board where they've put those systems in place, so there is that screening that's happening. Like, even if you have a teacher that is super committed to it, if they don't have access to those screening tools and there isn't an intervention framework in place, that if you need intervention, that they can ensure that that's provided to you, it's not going to happen. And then, of course, that's the position that we're in right now. It's not that there aren't good things happening in Ontario. There are lots of fantastic things happening in Ontario. It's just that they're not happening everywhere, and they're not happening for every child, right? So it's making sure that we can reach every child and make sure that they learn to read regardless of where they're born or what sort of resources their family has access to outside of the school system.
Yeah. And you know what? I know some great teachers that are working in some very at-risk communities, and that the children don't have that great conversational interaction at home. They may not even have books at home, but they're still having them reading by the end of kindergarten. And that's amazing. And that really speaks to what can be done with this structured literacy support. So with that early screening and getting those interventions in right away, not waiting until, they're a little bit older to see if they naturally develop it. There is that time where the plasticity of the brain is so perfect for this instruction. And we need to take advantage of it, especially when it comes to things like phonological and phonemic awareness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really the power of it, and of the Right to Read report, is that it's for all the kids. It's not just for the ones that have decoding problems. It's also for kids that come with lower language. They have the Scarborough's reading rope right in the inquiry report in the section under classroom instruction, right? Talking about the importance of the oral language as well. Yeah. And all of those sorts of things. And it's been so interesting in the criticism of the report. There's a professor or I guess he's a retired professor now from U of T, Jim Cummins, who's come out and said that it's too narrow in focus, and that it's, phonics only, and, ignoring all of these other things. And, if you read the report, it really doesn't read that way at all. Like, it does reference Scarborough's reading rope. It talks about the importance of this decoding piece within a full language curriculum. It talks about the importance of oral language. And one thing that I thought was so interesting is that he did a webinar a few weeks back through the University of Western Ontario, and somebody put into the questions of the chat, which was asked to him, would you have any problem with an approach to instruction that taught all of the pieces of Scarborough's reading rope systematically and explicitly? And he's like, no, that would be ideal. I was like, okay, that's what the report actually says. It's right there.
Well, and
I can show you the page.
It has that importance of the morphological awareness instruction, which I think is a key piece that has been missing from education for so long. And, you see it in various intervention programs. But now we're really seeing the power of having that instruction for all students. And it's now time for us to make sure that all teachers have the opportunity to know better so that they can do better, and support them on their learning journey, not leaving it to chance.
Yes, absolutely. And
And
that's why I'm really hoping that our new curriculum has that it's quite specific, and it goes, all, like, I believe they're writing up to grade 9 at this point, but especially for, grades, the older grades there's so much you can do with that morphology piece in those older grades. So I'm really hoping to see that in the new curriculum.
Yeah. Well, and making sure that it's not just the teachers that live near urban centers that get this great professional development. It needs to happen to even teachers in small hamlets where, there's one school within the town, and, the next town's 2 hours away. Those teachers need this instruction, I'd argue, even more.
Well, if you look at the provincial reading results, you can, I always joke that you can just sort of like measure the sort of area's results by their distance from a major urban center, right? Because it gets lower the further north you go, because there's many more challenges. Like, there's more challenges with getting kids into the buildings, into schools. There's more weather delays. Like, I live about 2 hours north of Toronto, and we have at least 3 times as many snow days where I live than they do in the city. There's all of these different pieces, right, that are sort of going into that. But fortunately, thanks to the internet, there's all of these fantastic online training programs that people can do now. We've got Zoom, so we can, reach people that way in terms of the teacher training piece. So yeah, I think you're right. Like, those northern and remote teachers need this even more, because so many times I feel like the contact with the students is more limited, right? So you need to be efficient with your time to get the most out of it that you possibly can.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me again. I think this was an amazing conversation, and I look forward to ones in the future.
Great. Thank you. It was great chatting with you again.